Massachusetts residents are outraged over the sticker shock they are increasingly experiencing when they open their gas and electric bills. In fact, a new survey from the Massachusetts Chamber's Policy Network found that energy affordability is now the top household concern in the state, beating out healthcare, housing, groceries, and transportation. That outrage over the high cost of energy is boiling over into political pressure on Beacon Hill to act. Coming out of a particularly cold winter, officials are scrambling to try to lower utility bills. Governor Maura Healey announced temporary relief for the months of February and March. But lowering the cost of electricity and gas in the long term is really hard. At the same time, the state has mandatory commitments for dramatically reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So how does Massachusetts thread that needle between lowering energy costs, meeting rising demand for electricity, and doing all of this in a way that also reduces emissions to meet our climate goals? I'm climate and energy reporter Jordan Woolman, and this is the Codcast, Commonwealth Beacon's podcast about policy and civic life here in Massachusetts. Today I'm joined by Kyle Murray, Director of State Program Implementation in Massachusetts at the environmental nonprofit Acadia Center, and Dan Dolan, President of the New England Power Generators Association. Thanks so much for being here.
Good to be here, Jordan.
Thanks for having us.
Dan, let's start with you. How do we get here? What are the main drivers here of increasing costs?
So I do think it's important to start at the beginning of how we got here. New England has historically had higher energy costs relative to our neighbors and competitive regions across the country. And a lot of it, I believe, is because we're effectively an energy island. Between having no traditional fossil fuel resources underfoot from an accident of geology, and the fact that we're tucked way up at the top corner of the northeast of the country, we have had very limited both electric transmission and fuel supply infrastructure connecting us to the rest of the United States and even to our Canadian neighbors to the north. Because of that, we have historically paid a premium for some of those delivered fuels, the cost of transportation and being at the proverbial end of the pipeline. It has also meant that, coupled with some of the public policies on land use, taxation, employment, and resource decisions, that we've limited ourselves to what degree of investment we want to see in this region. And very, very quickly, you back yourself into a place of where it is understandable of why Massachusetts and other New England states have made really big bets on things like offshore wind and solar power and batteries. And the challenge right now that we're facing is that after a decade of explicit statements about wanting to decarbonize that overall energy portfolio, the new large-scale clean energy resources have not come in at the speed or scale that many of us wanted or certainly anticipated. And yet we have retired a lot of those legacy assets. And so the market right now is running as thinly as I have ever seen in my career. And it is starting to have an overall price impact at the very moment in which we're also looking to invest heavily into some of those interconnecting projects on the transmission and other energy delivery side. Put it all together, coupled with a 2025 of a hot summer and a cold winter, and energy bills have gone up.
Kyle, let's bring you in here. Would love your response to that. And I'll also just throw in just a sort of gut check myself, frankly. Do we really have high energy costs? Is that narrative true relative to the rest of the country?
Yeah, it's interestingly enough, Dan and I agree on a lot of this stuff. You'd expect us to be at odds in many ways, but I actually agree with a lot of his assessment. I have some quibbles here and there with certain things, but if you look at New England as a region, it is devoid of those, natural fossil resources that have been talked about. It is a heavily forested area, which leads to very high costs. And we are also in older region in terms of our infrastructure. So we are seeing significant costs in terms of replacing that infrastructure and, versus other areas that are maybe a bit more spaced out. So we do see higher costs in those areas. And I kind of wish I was having this conversation with you in 2016, where we used to be able to say, yes, we have high rates, but actually our bills are middle of the pack. That is not actually the case anymore. Unfortunately, we do have some of the highest rates and some of the highest bills in the country. Now, the why is an important question. And, we would pin a lot of this on our over-reliance on natural gas as a resource. We, as a region, we rely over 50% on natural gas for both electric and gas supply. And so when you see those prices spike, you see costs go up. But also, as Dan pointed out, those renewable resources unfortunately have not come online as fast as we would have hoped. And, part of that is due to the Trump administration, both number one and number two. They weren't as overtly hostile in administration number one, but they were still gumming up the works, so to speak. But part of that is also on us as a state. We have not really done enough to really, we tried to sort of take a cautious approach towards moving forward with these big resource solicitations. And unfortunately, as a result, we are kind of behind where we would have hoped to be, as we are now seeing prices associated with natural gas start to spike. The other side of the thing, though, is that those delivery charges that we have are higher than other regions. And again, we pin those mainly on, aging infrastructure, heavily forested area, lot of storm damages really hurt us as a region. When we have storms, because of how heavily forested we are seeing increasing costs going to those storm damages. So, again, Dan and I agree on a lot of this. I think we'd quibble on the public policy things, but it is a real challenge in the region.
We've sort of talked about sort of like the present status quo here, but I want to also pay attention to the future. Of course, projections matter a lot, and where things, where the state wants to go matters. Two factors I want to throw into this conversation: the fact that electricity demand is going to go up, and that we want to meet that rising demand with cleaner sources. Kyle, why don't you kick us off here in terms of how you see the current affordability crisis meeting those two factors in the future?
Yeah, it's going to be a challenge, and like Dan has noted, this is a supply challenge as well. But our solutions are not limited to just, we need to bring in a ton of new supply. There is this assumption, a lot of the modeling has shown demand growth doubling, tripling in certain aspects. And we are absolutely, as we electrify, going to see demand growth. That is a fact of life. The question is how much? And there's a lot more that we can do to be creative on limiting demand growth that I think really will help curb the need for additional supply. Again, we're going to need more, but how much of it is really, that's a big question. There's a lot to be done on time of use rates, rate structures that can incentivize different hours of usage. And also, there's this idea that electrification means just demand growth. That isn't necessarily the case. An EV, an electric vehicle, is at the end of the day also a big battery. So yes, they draw from the grid, but they can also be used as a resource for the grid to export power during those peak periods. So there's also additional things to be done on transmission to other regions of the country and other countries. There's discussions that are going on with Nova Scotia right now to bring in offshore wind. Those will take time, not saying that's going to be an overnight solution or in any way guaranteed. But there's also regions of this country that have significant clean resources that with additional transmission, we could hopefully bring into the mix. So I just get a little frustrated when we talk about demand and the use going up, that it's just given that it's just treated as a given that, well, it's going to double or triple. There's things to be done on transmission. There's things to be done on demand reduction. If energy efficiency, a key resource, has kept demand low. Gas and electric demand have been flat or lower for the past, 15 years or so as a result of a lot of the work we've done in energy efficiency. So that's a lot of just dumping, but I'm sure Dan has thoughts as well.
So, Jordan, I do think it's important to take a step back. And I think as we look at electrification playing a larger role in the foundations of the economy and truly powering our economy overall, I think you're going to see a much closer correlation to economic growth with electric demand growth. And that is going to mean we're going to need more supply. That new incremental supply has to sit on a foundation of virtually every facility that is online today, staying online and then building on top of it. It's that yes and approach to resource development that Massachusetts and New England is really, really bad at, and we need to fix. Fundamentally, the issue here is also we're not going to be able to lean as much as the underlying expectations have been for generations on our neighbors, whether it's Quebec, New York, the Mid-Atlantic. Everybody is feeling a capacity and raw energy supply crunch in many parts of the country, even more acutely than New England. And we've already started to see it show up in the market beyond just tightness around pricing. If we go back to June 24th, 2015, we hit the highest electric demand peak in 13 years in New England. And going into every summer, the market operator does an assessment of what's the expected peak and what is a more extreme peak. That day, June, in which it's not usually the hottest period in the summer in New England, that exceeded that 90% forecast. It exceeded the peak of what the market was expecting for years into the future. So this is happening now. And the issue that we now face is how do we sustain that existing infrastructure and then chart a path forward of what those new resources are going to be. And on the new resource development side, I think we have to have a humble approach and a recognition that for better or worse, this industry has been purposely set up as a shared jurisdiction between the federal and state government. Neither one fully owns it, but they have to work in concert. And we've done this before. There have been countless amounts of administrations at both the state and the federal level that have been in opposing parties. But they have to be in conversation. And that has broken down over the last 18 months. And so the Venn diagram, the overlap of fuels and technologies that meet Washington policy needs and Beacon Hill's policy needs is getting vanishingly thin. And right now that is creating a bit of a frozen investment market of what is that durable policy financial signal to invest in facilities, both new and existing, that take decades to pay back. And I think we have to take a step back and say, as we look at the three-part priorities of this industry, being affordability, energy reliability, and a decarbonized economy, how do we balance those three elements, driving investment forward to now focus more on affordability and reliability than we have in quite some time?
Kyle, yeah.
And no, I definitely agree with Dan on a lot of that too. And I think it's important to note too, you're seeing a lot of strange bedfellows as you're seeing fossil fuel companies now pushing the Trump administration to allow for production of offshore wind. I think there's an acknowledgement that we really need this additional supply to come online. I will note that ISO New England, which is our regional grid administrator, has been in charge of interconnecting new generation and managing the wholesale markets. Has not until very recently moved to really modernize its processes for studying new generators trying to interconnect. And that's similar for new distributed generation, trying to interconnect at the local utility level. And ISO New England has recently overhauled some of their processes, so we may start seeing some additional interconnection happen at a quicker rate. I also would just flag, Dan noted that heat wave where we hit really extreme power usage. Really important to note the role that solar played in suppressing prices on that day. Without it, I think the 7 p.m. peak in ISO was around 1,500 per megawatt hour, something along the lines of there. But at around 2 p.m., even though energy use was higher, the peak was only around $200 per megawatt hour. I'm going off of memory here, so feel free to fact check me on that. But I mean, this really shows the important role that peak reduction can play. Like, $1,500 per megawatt hour to 200 or something is a really, really extreme difference.
Dan, I want to come back to I really liked how you framed this Venn diagram between Washington politics and Massachusetts politics. They feel so far apart many days out of the year. But when Governor Healy talks about being an all-of-the-above energy governor, that's a phrase that Republicans first started to use. At a high level, do you think that that's the right approach for this moment? Because the way I see it, there's only so many sources of power out there. There's coal, oil, and gas, fossil fuels that provide baseload power but pollute and have volatile pricing. You have solar and wind that are intermittent, at least without battery storage. You have nuclear, you have geothermal, you have hydro. So there's a couple other sources in there. But that's the mix, right? So I'm curious what you make of that all of the above approach and if that feels like a change from the way Democrats in Massachusetts were talking about energy just a few years ago.
All of the above is unquestionably the mindset that we have to have right now. And it has to be genuine. And that is true at both the state and the federal level. And in the same way that you're right, we've heard Republicans historically. I mean, it wasn't that many years ago. Charlie Baker was talking about all of the above. He called it his poo-poo platter of a little mix of everything. We need to have that genuinely play out in policy. And that does mean allowing facilities that are sited, financed, and under construction to complete construction, particularly offshore wind. It also means that when the market signals the need for a reinvestment in a fossil fuel facility or an expansion of a fossil fuel facility, that is also something that can be worked through under the state siting and financing policies that exist. So yes, all of the above is critical, but we have to mean it. That has to play out in policy beyond just those statements. And while I think the C-suite and the financiers and the investors watch that rhetoric closely, what they watch more carefully are the laws being passed by legislatures and the implementation of those laws by administrations. And that's where I think we need to start bringing some of this into closer alignment at both the state and the federal level.
Kyle, what do you think about all of the above? Is that the right approach? And does that feel like words, or does that feel like that's something that's actually going to be taken action on?
Sure. Obviously it's important to center our state's climate commitments as part of this and to factor in the fact that these are real costs that we have associated with climate issues. we are seeing increases in storm damage as a result of the, increased climate impacts we were having. But at the end of the day, a lot of people are just going to come back to talking about affordability, what they see on their energy bill. At the end of the day, you get your electric bill, and people are rightfully upset about that. So then the question, I think, partially becomes, what impact can these additional resources have on affordability? And much has been made of the fact that, there was a proposed pipeline back in 2016, 2015, around that time, that didn't end up going through. And, when you hear a lot of rhetoric around, if only we got that pipeline, we would have affordable energy in New England. We disagree with that premise. I personally disagree with that premise, because we've actually, interestingly enough, seen an expansion of gas into New England. There has been, through incremental increases, there has been around, since I think it's 2014, 2015, 2016, around 30% increase in gas flow into the region and gas supply. During that time, gas demand has been flat or lowered. And yet what we have seen during that period is continued increase in costs. So there is this sort of counterfactual that is very tough to go against. We're saying, like, if only we had this thing, we would have lower bills. But we sort of ran an experiment in real time. We increased gas supply by around 30%, and we did not see a correlating drop in supply costs.
So, Jordan, I have to fundamentally disagree, right? When you look at the three lowest wholesale electricity price years in the history of New England, and so that's the price coming out of the power plant, that supply cost itself, the three lowest years have all happened in the 2020s.
So let's actually get into the nitty gritty here, which is, you both sort of led me right to where I wanted to go next, which is, what's on your bill? It's supply, it's delivery, and it's public policy. And this goes for both electricity and for gas. And, just to be clear, because I think it can sometimes be confusing, natural gas is both a resource used to produce electricity, and then it's also used to heat your homes and to cook if you have a gas stove. So, Dan, why don't you take us through those three categories? And in your mind, what are, when you get into those three categories, what's increasing at the highest rates? What's driving this energy affordability crisis?
So the bottom line on your electric bill is every portion of that bill is going up. Far and away, the portion that is going up the fastest is that delivery infrastructure, those poles and wires on your streets and down the highways. Now, within that, it is effectively split in half. There is a federally regulated portion, which are the really big lines that you see down the interstates. And then there's the distribution networks down your neighborhood streets. Those are regulated at the state level. Both portions are going up. However, that federally regulated, that big bulk transmission system has just exploded over the last 20 years, has gone up roughly 9x in that period of time. Now, the reasons for that are complicated, and the vast majority of those investments are absolutely appropriate. We do have an aging infrastructure network. We are interconnecting more and more power sources farther and farther away from where we're consuming electricity. But we also have a situation in which it is the policy of the United States to create bonus rates of return for those large-scale transmission investments. And if you guaranteed me a roughly 12% rate of return, well, that's exactly where I would put all my 401k money to. But that right now is those transmission and distribution costs are going up tremendously. We've also seen the share of that public policy portion also go very high. Now, in fairness, it is the smallest portion of those three within the bill overall. But here, Massachusetts has the highest explicit cost on the production of electricity of any state in the United States, because we have both a cost of carbon through the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative that's been in place for over 20 years. But we also have a state-specific greenhouse gas program that is only applicable to electricity production. And we now pay over a $40 a ton price for electricity generated in Massachusetts, higher than California or any other place that we look at. And when we look at that, coupled with extremely aggressive renewable purchasing targets, in which there is not sufficient renewable energy online to meet those targets, and you start very quickly getting into a place in which we're creating punitive payments on customer bills for which there are no alternatives in the marketplace to meet those needs.
So Kyle, let's get into the public policy portion. We need to talk about Mass Save, which, was the most contentious part of the energy affordability bill that the House passed last month. That bill, which was prompted by Governor Healy, who filed her own version of it in 2025, would cut Mass Save by $1 billion with a B. That's a big part of this public policy portion of the bill that we're talking about. Walk me through the trade-offs of a decision like that. Again, it hasn't been fully, it still needs to pass the Senate. There's a long legislative process here. But just the policy signal that sends, I think it's worth talking through those trade-offs.
Yeah, I have many thoughts, as you might imagine. The first is just basic math. So there is a flag in the bill that the cuts are supposed to focus on administration and marketing and advertising. By about the time this bill will be done, let's roughly estimate September-ish, between when it goes through, a lot of work to be done. And then it takes a few months to implement, for the program administrators to actually implement these cuts. So you're largely focusing on 2027. The marketing and administration budget for 2027 is $150 million. Is that high? That's debatable. We can have a conversation about that. But there is nowhere near $1 billion in marketing and administration. The vast majority of the money in Mass Save goes to incentives. And so what is going to be cut is incentives. The program itself will be cut, and very likely many parts of the program will be shut down. Is that acceptable? I don't know. That not to me, but I would just appreciate when having this discussion if people would be candid about what $1 billion cut would actually do to the program. Now, it's important to note that any investments that Mass Save has to make have to be cost effective. They run through a very strict calculator to look at, is this investment cost effective? And those are run before the Department of Public Utilities. So investments that Mass Save makes already have to be cost effective. And the figure is generally a 3-to-1 return on, for every dollar you invest in Mass Save, there are about $3 in benefits you get from the program. There has been a trend recently of people kind of not really believing the benefits are real, because, looking at public health benefits, climate benefits. So some of the things we've started to focus on a bit are purely electric, gas, and delivered fuel supply and infrastructure savings as a result of this. And I can say that from 2016 to 2024, electric, gas, and supply and delivered fuel supply and infrastructure savings was about over $16 billion. So that's, if we did not have Mass Save in place, we would have had to pay $16 billion additional on those side of things. For that, we invested $8 billion in Mass Save. So invested $8 billion in mass save, avoided $16 billion in electric, gas, and delivered fuels supply and infrastructure. So that's literally just, it is a program that saves money. And that is what very much frustrates me when it is discussed purely in terms of costs. We do not talk about the benefits of the program as much.
Dan, I'm coming to you to close this out. I think I should have, frankly, for our audience, I should have said Mass Save, just to level set. Mass Save is a program that weatherizes homes, installs heat pumps at low or no cost, but it's funded by a charge on your utility bill. So that's why it's become sort of a sticking point in this conversation, is it's one of the few things that Beacon Hill could right now do to lower your utility bill. But as Kyle points out, there are then trade-offs down the line when if energy efficiency mechanisms aren't installed in homes. Dan, what do you think about Beacon Hill's response to this energy affordability issue that we've been talking about, this legislation that's become the centerpiece of that response, and the mass save cuts that have now been introduced into that dialogue?
So I'll let others get into the costs and the benefits of things like per dollar on energy efficiency. But as I look at the House-passed energy bill, specific on the supply side, where are the new investments going to come from? It's very disappointing. We're seeing a double down on failed policies to contract for large-scale resources, the vast majority of which have had contracts canceled, have not shown up, or have been largely delayed because of financing and siting challenges. And it is just a further signal to those looking to either expand or keep operational the workhorses on the grid that have kept the lights on and the heat going through the heat waves and the cold snaps we've talked about, to invest somewhere else, to not stay here in Massachusetts. And that is disappointing. That all being said, we take our reliability responsibilities extraordinarily seriously. And we're going to do what is necessary to make sure that these facilities can stay operational. But at a certain point, there are real consequences to the policies that are explicitly put out in the Commonwealth. And right now, we're not seeing that focus in on what is quite often the cheapest source of supply, which is the one that's already been built.
We could keep going, but I think we kind of have to leave it here. We're out of time for today. Kyle and Dan, thanks so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Jordan.
Thanks again to Kyle and Dan for joining me on the Codcast, and thank you for listening. I'm Jordan Woolman. Our production and theme music is done by Charlie Cozella. Leave a rating and review wherever you're hearing this now if you want to help other folks find us. And email codcast@commonwealthbeacon.org if you ever want to get in touch directly. We'll be back in your ears next week.